The first mistake I made about Jay Gatsby was assuming that he wanted to cross the bay. At the time, it seemed obvious. When I moved to Long Island in the summer of 1922, I found myself living in West Egg, one of two pieces of land facing each other across the water. West Egg was where the newly rich lived, people whose fortunes had appeared quickly through business, entertainment, speculation, and sometimes dealings that were better left unexplained. They built enormous houses because they wanted everyone to know they had finally arrived. Their cars were louder, their parties were bigger, their clothes were brighter. There was a feeling in West Egg that money was not worth having unless someone else could see you spending it. Across the bay was East Egg. That was where my cousin Daisy lived with her husband Tom Buchanan. The people of East Egg had a different relationship with money. They did not need to display it so loudly because it had been sitting in their families for generations. Their names carried weight. They seemed to move through life with the quiet confidence of people who had never seriously considered the possibility of losing everything. The residents of East Egg looked at West Egg as though money acquired too recently still carried the smell of work. The two places were separated by water, but the distance between them was far greater than the width of the bay. My nearest neighbour lived in the largest house in West Egg. It was an enormous mansion designed to resemble a French palace, complete with marble steps, towers, gardens, and more rooms than any one man could possibly need. His name was Jay Gatsby. At least that was the name people used. Before I ever spoke to Gatsby, I saw him standing alone outside his house. It was late. The parties had not yet begun for the summer, and the mansion behind him was dark. Gatsby walked to the edge of his lawn and looked across the water toward East Egg. Then he stretched out his arms. At first, I thought he might be trembling. I followed his gaze and noticed a small green light glowing at the end of a dock on the opposite shore. I assumed Gatsby was looking at East Egg the way a hungry man might look through the window of a restaurant. He had money, certainly, probably more than most people could spend in a lifetime. But perhaps he wanted something else. Acceptance, respectability, the right to stand among people who had inherited the position he had worked to create. Perhaps the green light represented the place he hoped to reach next. Before I could introduce myself, Gatsby lowered his arms and disappeared into the darkness. Not long after that, the parties began. Every weekend, Gatsby's mansion filled with strangers. They came in expensive cars from New York. Some were actors, politicians, businessmen whose money had been made so quickly that nobody had yet decided whether to admire or investigate them. Most people were never invited. They simply arrived. They stepped through Gatsby's gates, drank his champagne, ate his food, and behaved as though his house belonged to anyone confident enough to enter it. One afternoon, a servant appeared at my door carrying a formal invitation. Gatsby had asked me to attend his party. That alone made me unusual. I may have been one of the only people there who had actually been invited. By the time I arrived, the party had already taken over the estate. An orchestra played in the garden. Waiters moved between the guests carrying drinks. People danced beneath strings of lights while others disappeared into the mansion and returned with stories of rooms they had no business entering. The celebration felt endless, and somewhere within it all was Gatsby. The problem was that nobody seemed to know where. I found Jordan Baker among the guests. Jordan was a professional golfer and a close friend of my cousin Daisy. She had the calm confidence of a woman who rarely worried about whether she belonged in a room. Together we began asking people whether they had seen our host. Instead of answers, we heard rumours. One woman leaned toward us and whispered that Gatsby had once killed a man. Someone else claimed he had been a German spy during the war. Another guest had heard that Gatsby was related to European royalty. Nobody knew which story was true. That did not stop them from repeating the stories as though they had personally witnessed them. It was strange. Hundreds of people were drinking Gatsby's alcohol and dancing inside his home, yet none of them could say who he really was. As the evening continued, I began speaking to a polite man near one of the tables. He was not much older than I was. He asked whether I had served in the war, and when I mentioned my division, his face brightened. We had been stationed in some of the same places. We spoke comfortably for several minutes. Eventually I admitted that I had been invited to the party, but had not yet met Gatsby. The man smiled. "I'm Gatsby," he said. I had expected someone louder. A man who threw parties like these should have been at the centre of the garden, demanding to be admired. Instead, Gatsby seemed almost removed from everything around him. He did not drink heavily. He did not lose himself in the dancing. He just watched. That was the mystery of Gatsby's parties. He created them, paid for them, filled his house with hundreds of people. But he behaved as though he were waiting for the real event to begin. Later that night, I noticed him standing apart from the crowd. While everyone else danced beneath the lights, Gatsby looked across the bay, toward the green light. My curiosity deepened. What could possibly be waiting for him on the other side? That evening, Gatsby asked to speak privately with Jordan. They disappeared into the house for almost an hour. When Jordan returned, she looked as though Gatsby had trusted her with something important. She refused to tell me what they had discussed. Not immediately, she had claimed. The request reached me a few days later. It sounded simple. Gatsby wanted me to invite Daisy to my house for tea. I was not to tell her that he would be there. Only then did I realise where the green light stood. It was at the end of Daisy's dock. Gatsby had not been staring at East Egg in general. He had been staring at her house. And suddenly, everything began to make sense. The music, the crowds, the open gates, the rumours moving from West Egg to East Egg. Gatsby was not throwing parties because he loved parties. He was sending signals across the water. He wanted Daisy to hear about the mysterious millionaire living opposite her home. He wanted the music to reach her, the stories about his wealth to travel through the people she knew. He wanted curiosity to pull her through his gates. Every weekend, Gatsby created the most spectacular evening in New York and waited for one woman to appear. But Daisy never came. To understand why Gatsby had built an entire life around that possibility, I had to understand who he had been before the mansion and the parties. Before the name Jay Gatsby, he had been born James Gatz, the son of poor farmers from the Midwest. From a young age, James refused to accept that the life he had inherited was the life he was meant to live. He imagined another version of himself, a wealthier, more impressive version, a man who could enter any room without being reminded where he came from. James Gatz was the boy he had been born as. Jay Gatsby was the man he intended to become. Years before I met him, Gatsby had arrived in Louisville as a young military officer preparing to leave for war. That was where he met Daisy Faye. Daisy was beautiful. But beauty alone did not explain what she became to him. Everything around her suggested wealth, the house she lived in, the clothes she wore, the people who visited her, the ease with which she moved through the world. Daisy had never needed to invent herself. She had been born into the kind of life Gatsby had spent years imagining. When Gatsby fell in love with her, he also fell in love with everything she represented. Comfort, status, belonging. Proof that he had finally escaped the life of James Gatz. But there was a problem. Gatsby was not the wealthy young man Daisy believed him to be. He was an officer with little money and an uncertain future, so he allowed her to misunderstand him. He presented himself as someone who naturally belonged in her world. It was the first great illusion he created for Daisy. Then Gatsby left for the war. They promised to wait for each other. Gatsby believed that when he returned, their story would continue exactly where it had stopped. But Daisy's life did not pause simply because Gatsby was away. Letters became less satisfying. The war continued. The future Gatsby had promised remained uncertain. Then Tom Buchanan arrived. Tom did not need to reinvent himself. He had been born into the position Gatsby was trying to reach. He had the family name, the education, the houses, the careless confidence of a man who had never been asked to prove that he belonged. He gave Daisy a string of pearls worth more than most families would earn in years, and Daisy married him. By the time Gatsby returned, the woman he loved had become Mrs. Tom Buchanan. Most people would have accepted that they had arrived too late. Gatsby did not. He decided that Daisy had not truly chosen Tom over him. She had chosen security. She had chosen the life Gatsby had not yet been able to provide. And so Gatsby began turning himself into the man he believed Daisy had been waiting for. He made money, a great deal of it. Some of it came through businesses that could not survive close examination. Prohibition had made alcohol illegal, but it had also made men willing to break the law extremely wealthy. Gatsby became involved with people who understood this very well. He bought the mansion in West Egg, not because he loved the house or enjoyed the attention, but because Daisy lived directly across the bay. And there he stood, night after night, staring toward the small green light at the end of her dock. Gatsby believed he had finally become worthy of her. The tragedy was that he had spent 5 years preparing to return to a moment that no longer existed. Still, I agreed to arrange the meeting. The day Daisy came to my house was rainy. Gatsby sent someone to cut my grass as a thank you for setting up the meeting. Then the flowers arrived. So many flowers that my small living room looked as though it had been swallowed by a garden. Gatsby arrived wearing a pale suit and the expression of a man facing execution. I had watched him move through a party of hundreds without appearing nervous. But the thought of Daisy walking through my door reduced him to panic. He checked the time, stared through the window, complained that she was late. Then he announced that he should leave. A few moments later, Daisy's car pulled into the drive. Gatsby disappeared. For a moment, I genuinely thought he had escaped. Then there was a knock at the door. Gatsby had walked around the house in the rain so that he could enter as though he had only just arrived. Even in his most vulnerable moment, he was trying to control the scene. But once Daisy stood before him, the performance collapsed. Neither of them knew what to say. 5 years of longing had led to this moment. Yet Gatsby could barely look at her. The room filled with the unbearable silence of two people confronting a memory that had suddenly become real. Gatsby leaned against the mantelpiece. Behind him sat a clock. In his nervousness, he almost knocked it to the floor. He caught it just in time. It was an awkward little moment, but I could not stop thinking about it. There was Gatsby, trying to prevent time from slipping out of his hands, so I left them alone. When I returned, the atmosphere had changed. The rain outside had begun to clear. Daisy had been crying. Gatsby looked transformed. For years, he had carried a perfect image of this reunion inside him. Now reality had finally entered the room, and for a few hours, reality seemed willing to cooperate. Gatsby took Daisy across to his mansion. He showed her the enormous rooms, the gardens, the furniture, the view across the water. Every object felt like part of a presentation. This is what I became. This is what I built. This is what you could have had if you had waited. Eventually, Gatsby opened his wardrobe and began throwing shirts across a table. Beautiful shirts in different colours and fabrics piled in front of Daisy. Daisy buried her face in them and began to cry. She said she had never seen such beautiful shirts before. It would be easy to dismiss that moment as shallow. A wealthy woman crying over expensive clothes. But Daisy was not really crying about the shirts. The shirts represented time. They represented Gatsby's transformation. They proved that the poor young officer she had loved had become rich enough to give her the life she had chosen with someone else. Perhaps Daisy was mourning the years they had lost and the decision she had made. Or perhaps she was overwhelmed by the realization that Gatsby had built all of this around the memory of her. That afternoon, Gatsby finally stood beside Daisy and looked across the bay. He pointed toward the green light at the end of her dock. But now that Daisy was beside him, the light had changed. It was only a light again. Its power had come from distance. For years, Gatsby had been able to fill that light with every possibility he could imagine. Now the dream had crossed the water and become a real woman standing inside his house. And real people are always more complicated than dreams. For a while, Gatsby refused to see the difference. He did not only want Daisy to love him in the present. He wanted her to erase the previous 5 years, for her to tell Tom that she had never loved him. He wanted the marriage undone, and every choice Daisy had made without him to disappear. When I warned Gatsby that he could not repeat the past, he looked at me as though I'd said something ridiculous. Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can. That was the centre of everything Gatsby believed. He did not think time had moved forward. He believed it had paused and waited for him to become rich enough. The dream finally began to collapse on one of the hottest days of the summer. We were all gathered at the Buchanan's house. Daisy, Tom, Gatsby, Jordan, and me. Tom had begun to understand what was happening between his wife and Gatsby. The tension in the room became impossible to ignore. Daisy suggested that we drive into New York. It was the kind of careless suggestion people make when they want to escape a conversation that has already begun. We ended up in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. The room was hot. The windows offered no relief. Everyone was irritable. And everything that had remained hidden finally came into the open. Gatsby told Tom that Daisy had never loved him. Then he turned to Daisy. He needed her to confirm it. Daisy tried. She said she was leaving Tom. She said she loved Gatsby. But Gatsby wanted more. He wanted her to say that she had never loved her husband. That every year with Tom had been a mistake. That nothing meaningful had happened since the day Gatsby left for war. Daisy could not do it. She had loved Gatsby, but she had also loved Tom once. Perhaps not in the perfect, permanent way Gatsby imagined love should exist. but enough that she could not erase it. For Gatsby, this was devastating. His dream required the past to remain untouched. Daisy's marriage had to be meaningless. Otherwise, Gatsby had not returned to reclaim the life stolen from him. He had arrived to ask a married woman to abandon the life she had built. Tom recognized the weakness in Gatsby's story. He began exposing the source of Gatsby's fortune: the illegal alcohol, the criminal connections, the businesses created to disguise where the money had really come from. Gatsby had believed that becoming rich would make him equal to Tom, but Tom understood something Gatsby had never fully accepted. Old money did not judge new money only by how much it possessed. It judged where the money came from, how long the family had held it, whether the person carrying it knew the unwritten rules. Gatsby had crossed the financial distance between West Egg and East Egg, but socially the bay remained. Daisy began to retreat, and Gatsby saw it happen. Yet even then he believed he could repair everything later. That evening, Daisy drove Gatsby's car back toward Long Island. As they passed through the Valley of Ashes, a woman named Myrtle Wilson ran into the road. Myrtle was Tom's mistress. She had seen Gatsby's yellow car earlier and believed Tom was inside it. Daisy struck her. She did not stop. Myrtle died on the road. Gatsby immediately decided that he would take responsibility if anyone asked. Even then, he continued protecting Daisy. That night, I found him standing outside the Buchanan's house. He was watching the windows. He told me he was waiting in case Tom became violent with her. Gatsby believed Daisy was inside preparing to leave her husband. But through the window I could see Daisy and Tom sitting together at the kitchen table. They were speaking quietly over cold food. They did not look happy, but they looked united. There was an intimacy in the way they leaned toward one another. Not simply the intimacy of marriage, the intimacy of two people who understood that, whatever happened, their wealth would protect them. Gatsby remained outside, guarding a dream that had already abandoned him. The next day he waited for Daisy's telephone call. The call never came. Tom told Myrtle's grieving husband, George Wilson, that Gatsby owned the yellow car. George arrived at Gatsby's mansion. He found Gatsby in his swimming pool and shot him before taking his own life. Gatsby died waiting for Daisy. The house was quiet. No orchestra, no dancing, no expensive cars crowding the road, no strangers wandering through the gardens. Only Gatsby in the water, and a telephone that would never carry Daisy's voice. After his death, I began contacting the people who had filled his home every weekend. They had eaten his food, drunk his alcohol, and built entire evenings around the mystery of his name. Now they all had excuses: business, travel, prior commitments. Almost none of them came to his funeral. Daisy and Tom left town. They did not send flowers or leave an address. They simply disappeared. They retreated into their money and allowed other people to carry the consequences of what they had done. That was what I finally understood about them. Tom and Daisy were careless people. They damaged lives and then withdrew into the protection of their wealth. Gatsby had spent years trying to become worthy of Daisy, but worthiness had never been the true requirement for entering her world. The requirement was to have been born inside it. I once believed Gatsby stared at the green light because he wanted to move from West Egg to East Egg. Later, I believed he stared because Daisy lived there. In the end, I realised that the two explanations were almost the same. Gatsby could never separate Daisy from what she represented. She was the woman he loved, but she was also wealth, acceptance, beauty, status, proof that James Gatz had disappeared forever. That was why losing Daisy meant losing far more than one woman. It meant confronting the possibility that everything Gatsby had built still could not change where he truly belonged. And yet, there was something remarkable about him. Gatsby believed in his dream completely, more completely than Daisy deserved. He reached toward the green light because he believed the future was waiting just across the water. Perhaps that is why his story continues to haunt us.
If Gatsby's story has made you curious, then read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald on www.amplereads.com. It's absolutely free. And for more stories from classic books, subscribe to our channel.